The student protest definitely shows how urgent this topic is for the young people. It really shows that many young people really have a better feeling about going into that. There's so many, you speak to people who are out of university and they have problem finding a job, and then you think, ooh, soon we have to pay 10,000, 9,000 pounds a month, a year. So I can fully understand the anger and the distress there. And so I think demonstration is always a good way to express yourself. But it should be peaceful. It should always be a peaceful sort of expressing yourself. And when it goes over to violence, we just destroy our image. And it's just, of course, a few people who just.
I mean, if okay, on the first protest, it was on the 10th of November, 9th of November, when they occupied Millbank.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, if they had gone. If all the students there had just gone from A to B, shouted their slogans, said their little speeches, had the head of the TUC say their little speech, and then they'd all gone home peacefully, would it have been covered by the media?
No.
Would people have actually given a crap?
Interestingly, on that point, is that before the story of Millbank broke, the Evening Standard went to print in London. And the student protest, bear in mind, there's 52,000 people marching through London.
It's a sizable protest,
massive, it was absolutely huge. And brought central London to a standstill. Bearing in mind all of that in the Evening Standard, which is the London newspaper, it reached page 16. And then the next day, once the Millbank story had broken, you know, the journalists have a fetish for broken windows,
broken windows and violent anarchist minorities.
Basically broken windows they have a big fetish for, and it's all over the front page.
I personally
Sorry,
respect the right of any individual, if they disagree with something that's been proposed, to voice their opinion, and with other individuals who feel the same. The idea of a protest, even a sit-in, if it's well controlled, is a fine idea. And if people want to do that, then they are more entitled. They are entitled to do so, and they are within their rights. The problem was, and what let down the protest, is that individuals who perhaps, you know, were out and didn't have any great concern about the dignity in which the protest would be conveyed. Perhaps individuals who didn't even have any kind of affiliation with an academic institute but decided they wanted to go out and they wanted to cause some aggro. Let a small group of people attack the Millbank office building, where only one floor of the building is actually the offices of the Conservative Party, but disrupt the work of people with nothing to do with this, who were just sitting in their offices and found their building being trashed. It caused damage and there was violence, which was deplorable. And of course, the vast majority of the individuals who went out that day to protest were doing so perfectly legitimately and calmly and rationally, and were letting their point be heard. The problem is that a very small minority, and you can't say that they did not know this, they may have been carried away by a frenzy that they felt with.
Very small.
There's a lot of people. Going back to what you said about
in comparison to
the whole massive was
who was protesting that day? The big groups that proceeded through London. How many of them were causing violence?
Okay, fine. Let's assume that there was a negligible minority in Millbank breaking windows.
There were reports of about 120
graffiti,
people. I don't
tourist councils.
No.
I mean, no. But okay. Going back to the point you made about carrying protests in a dignified manner, when was the last time that a dignified protest was publicised in the media? When was the last time people gave
What did the Stop the War campaign do?
Yeah.
1 million people. What did 1 million people do?
They marched.
That's a sizable part of the country.
They marched, but
whilst the protest...
What did Make Poverty History do?
Whilst the protest attracted the media, it was negative feedback that they got. The protest, it did little to help the student.
If I could
doesn't matter if publicity is good or bad. Publicity is publicity.
The problem was, it did not help the student cause.
Yeah,
the majority of the people in this country, I'm not saying whether it's a small, or a large majority, but the majority of people in this country who were unaffiliated with anybody going to university, who aren't concerned with it, this who haven't been following what's going on and do not fully understand the anger of students, for them to turn on their TV and see some office buildings being trashed, it had a detrimental effect.
I'd like to sort of clear things up, if I may, just a bit, with someone who's been at
Please do so.
every student protest so
Yes.
far. And the thing was that I think people marched, people came out in forcible numbers. It wasn't a small minority at Millbank. It was a minority, yes,
It was
certainly a minority,
yes.
but it wasn't a
Sizable
small.
one.
It was a sizable one. It was the Millbank complex itself is.
In terms of
Sorry, if I can.
Of course, yes.
Just sort of build on the points you've already made. And
Yes,
come to any
that's
other
fair enough.
points. But it was a sizable minority. And the thing here is important to keep in perspective. People turn on the television scenes, they see people, broken glass, oh God, the horror, windows break in, we should have a day of mourning, whatever. But the point here, and also with the clashes with the police at the beginning of December, is to keep this whole thing in perspective, okay?
Yes.
In the grand scheme of things. The thing is that we have here a situation where people are so unhappy with the government, also the Liberal Democrats, who have basically got into power on a lie and got people's votes on a lie.
Primarily amongst students
And-
with the Liberal Democrats.
Yes, indeed, primarily
Yes.
amongst students. And to say that there were people who weren't affiliated with students doesn't mean they don't have a vested interest in these things as well. Because there were trade
that's
unions
true.
there, there were parents and teachers there as well.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that the reason it's such a shock, okay, and this is what people need to remember, the reason it's such a shock, broken windows and I wouldn't say violence, I'd say damage to property.
There was
Quite a different
violence.
thing.
We can't forget.
Apart from
We
the
can't
police,
forget the
I mean.
violence. So.
Okay, but the important thing I think is the reason it's such a shock to us in this country is because it's so rare. It
That's
is very
true.
rare. Now, the reason it's rare is because generally we sit back and let these things happen. I think the very fact that people are willing to go to these measures and are so passionate about this is indicative of the crisis we're in, where we have a government which does not listen to its people, has its own agenda, and is basically just trampling on people. And people, and the other thing is that lots of people say, well, they should just wait until it's time to vote.
Mm.
A lot of the people on these protests have been 15, 16, 17. They're the people that's
Yes.
They're
most
going to be
affected
affected
by
by the
this.
tuition fee.
Most affected. And I think it's important to keep things in perspective, okay? I think it's, no one's died. In the case of the guy throwing the fire extinguisher, that was one person.
People were injured though, and we can't forget.
People
about
have been
that.
injured, but more protesters than police. And it's important to remember that, while one guy threw a fire extinguisher in, what I'm sure personally was at the heat of the moment, it wasn't premeditated, he was a young,
But
young
still-
kid.
But I
A
don't think
dangerous act.
it was a dangerous act,
very
but
different, very much.
I don't think it should be taken as representative of the student
Yes.
opinion or
No,
the student
no.
mentality.
No,
It was
what
deplorable.
would the
Very,
media
very-
pick up on that?
But it was the students who told the police to move out of the way. And it's the students who immediately deplored what was happening. Now, in the most recent ones, in the 10th and Parliament Square, having been there, it was a jovial carnival atmosphere,
Yes.
right up until the moment the police started using violence. And then people started reacting. And what happened was we were there for, kettled for a period of 9 hours, which is a long time to be without food, water, toilets, out in the cold. And
I think
There were sporadic
failures
acts.
on both sides.
There were
We can't
sporadic
say that both
acts.
sides are
I
entirely.
wouldn't say there were failures because on both sides, because the march was going as intended. It was meant to end up on and join up with the NUS,
But we can't
candidate vigil
be so
on
naive
embankment.
as to say
and
that-
it wasn't allowed to get there.
Yes, I'm sure that the vast majority of those who had been there were entirely peaceful. But we can't be so naive as to say that there was no threat of violence, that there was no aggro caused
Yes,
by
yes,
students.
yes,
Of course,
but
of course,
the
but
violence
think
is
about it.
indicative of what's
If
happening.
you
Well, that's all very well and good.
It's all very well and good
Yeah,
to just
say
condemn
that, yeah.
to condemn broken windows and say, well, that's deplorable. That's not anything a normal, rational person would do. These
It's
are not
the
normal
broken
times.
windows.
These are not normal times. No one's been, no one's been killed. The idea that police were dragged off their horses is a complete lie. On the 10th of December, 8 police officers were injured. The only one who was seriously injured was trampled by his own horse, and he was nowhere near the protesters. Meanwhile, there were people who had been hit on heads. I saw some people knocked unconscious myself.
Yes.
One girl was knocked unconscious and protesters were trying to carry her out of the kettle, and the police wouldn't even let her through. Well, they weren't letting the injured out, they weren't letting anyone out, there were children there. There were parents the other side of the police lines saying, let my children out, and they were saying no, and obviously they're just following orders. But what we've got here is to just sort of deplore violence at all and say, well, you
But you've got to
protest
condemn the
peacefully.
violence. You can't.
I don't condemn broken windows, no.
Well, broken windows is one thing, but there was
Okay, I'm pretty.
actual violence.
I think
No,
most
there
of us here. I think
there was-
most
there
of
was-
us here.
yes,
Sorry, I
yes.
do agree. There was a minority of violent thugs at
Yes.
protests,
Yes.
absolutely, and they were the police.
Did you hear about the law that got passed recently that now allows the police to use fire
Water
hoses?
cannons.
Water
That's
cannons,
yeah, very good.
pretty scary sounding.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm pretty sure that most students wouldn't break windows. Okay, but
Yes.
if there weren't a minority of students who broke windows, no one would listen to us. So
I mean,
as a
I mean,
student
yes.
myself, who wouldn't break windows because I'm just a pacifist,
I'm not
I'm actually quite glad that other people are breaking windows.
I'm not
for
hung
me.
up on broken windows. My concern with what happened with the violence and with what was
So which
Which-
violence?
it's-
Which violence? I don't.
We've-
I don't
we've
know
talked-
what
we've
you're talking
talked
about.
about
Which
violence.
violence?
let me say,
Against a person?
there was
What's
there-
happening? Yeah, I saw there. There was loads of people with batons hitting people around the head.
Yes,
Those?
and there was
I presume it was
violence
those.
from the
They
side
were the
of
police
the
who were just in
students.
riot gear.
I mean, you look at
What
the
violence? People were holding their hands up. They didn't. They were unarmed. A man got dragged out
There
of his
was.
wheelchair.
I know. I'm not naive enough not to know that there is.
Do you support the police in this then?
I have to say,
Do you think
I don't have my hands up and say the police did a wonderful job and that everything was completely right. I know that there is violence at these things on behalf of the police. I'm not saying the police are innocent. I think, to be honest with you, that there was violence on both sides. But then my concern with it is that you look how this is portrayed in the media, how this violence is portrayed, and in a way it lets down the student
There
protest.
is
And
no
it's
such
those
thing
students-
Then it's the media letting the students down.
There
The
is
media
no
just
such
media
thing
has their
as
own job.
bad publicity. Publicity is
We
publicity.
can't-
Publicity
we can't
is a
write-
way of having your voice heard one way or another.
We can't write to the media and say, dear media, can you please portray us in a positive light because we've got a very sincere message.
It depends
Of
on the
course,
media.
but
Look, it
otherwise
depends
they
on the
won't
media
portray-
that
portray
you
a
read. I
message
mean,
at all.
obviously, if you read The Sun, they're going to be like,
Yeah,
all
no
these
respect for
students are a
newspapers.
bunch of thuggish pinkos. But if you read, I don't know, The Guardian, it's somewhat, let's face it, more educated.
Well,
on the
okay.
protest.
There's not a single respectable newspaper that has supported the police and not supported the students.